The morning fog clung to the Clinch River like wet muslin when the Lockets surfaced on Miller's Beach, catching sunlight between the smooth river stones. Two identical gold pieces, their chains still bright, their engravings sharp as the day they were crafted. But these lockets had been missing for 103 years, vanished with the Hensley twins on a September Sunday in 1918, when Appalachian rivers ran wild and families kept secrets deeper than mountain hollers. The local fisherman who found them, Wade Cartwright, knew the stories his grandmother whispered about the girls who walked into Sunday morning and never walked out. What stopped his breath wasn't the lockets themselves, it was what surrounded them. Two sets of footprints pressed into the wet sand, small and delicate, leading from the water's edge toward the tree line before vanishing into nothing. Fresh prints, made that morning. In mud that had been dry for weeks until the night before, when autumn rains finally broke the season's drought. The sound of church bells carried differently through Copper Creek Valley in September of 1918, their bronze voices echoing off limestone cliffs that had watched over the Hensley family for 3 generations. 20-year-old twins, Mabel and Beth Hensley, stepped from their family's whitewashed cabin into morning air that tasted of wood smoke and approaching winter, their matching Sunday dresses rustling against the porch boards their father had hewn from mountain oak. The twins moved with the unconscious synchronicity of sisters who had shared every breath since birth. Mabel adjusting Beth's collar, Beth smoothing Mabel's hair beneath her hat. Their mother, Ruth, watched from the doorway with the careful attention of a woman who had buried 3 children before these 2 survived their difficult birth. "Be back before dark," she called, though the twins had never missed Sunday supper in their 20 years. The walk to Cedar Grove Baptist Church followed the same path the twins had taken every Sunday since they could walk. Down the slope through hickory groves, past the old Cherokee boundary stones that local families pretended not to see, across the wooden bridge their grandfather had built before the war between the states. Other families joined the procession. The Brewers with their 6 children, the widow Morrison clutching her worn Bible, the Baker boys who still smelled faintly of their father's moonshine operation. Pastor Williams delivered his sermon about the prodigal son to a congregation that knew every word by heart, but listened anyway because Sunday mornings were as much about community as salvation. The twins sat in their usual pew, 3rd row from the front, sharing a hymnal they had memorized years ago. Their voices rose together during Amazing Grace, clear and pure as mountain water. After the service, the congregation lingered in the churchyard as they always did, men discussing tobacco prices and weather patterns, while women exchanged preserving recipes and gentle gossip. The twins helped their mother organize the monthly food collection for the widow Perry, counting jars of green beans and cornmeal into baskets. "We're going to walk down to the river," Mabel told her mother as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "Beth wants to gather some of those late wildflowers for pressing." Ruth Hensley nodded, used to her daughter's afternoon wanderings. The twins had explored every trail, creek, and hidden grove within 5 miles of their home. They knew the mountains like Cherokee blood knew the seasons, instinctively, completely. The last person to see the Hensley twins alive was Thomas Morrison, the widow's 14-year-old son, who was fishing for catfish where Copper Creek emptied into the Clinch River. He watched them walking along the bank, their white dresses bright against the dark water. Beth carrying a small basket for flowers, while Mabel pointed toward something across the river he couldn't quite see. They looked happy, Thomas would tell searchers later, like they was going to a party instead of just picking flowers. When the sun touched the ridgetops and the twins hadn't returned, Ruth Hensley felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had haunted her since her other children's deaths. Dawn broke gray and cold over Copper Creek Valley as 23 men gathered in the Hensley yard, their breath steaming in air that promised an early winter. Sheriff Ben Crawford had driven up from the county seat in his Model T Ford, the automobile's engine coughing and sputtering on the narrow mountain road like a mechanical prayer for the missing girls. "They know these woods better than the deer," Ruth Hensley said, her voice steady despite the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "If they're lost, it ain't by accident." The search party divided into 3 groups. The first followed the riverbank downstream, looking for any sign the twins might have fallen into the swollen Clinch. September rains had been heavy that year, turning the normally placid river into a rushing torrent capable of sweeping away anything that touched its surface. The second group combed the woods above the creek, checking hunting camps and abandoned cabins. The third searched the old Cherokee trails that crisscrossed the mountains, paths that appeared on no surveyor's map but were known to families who had lived in these hollers since before Tennessee became a state. For 3 days, the men searched. They found deer trails and bear sign, abandoned moonshine stills from the previous decade, and the remnants of Cherokee settlements that local families preferred not to discuss. They found Mary Beth's hair ribbon caught on a blackberry bramble near the river, and one of Mabel's hairpins pressed into mud beside a limestone outcropping. But they found no bodies, no clothing, no sign of struggle or violence. "It's like they just walked into thin air," Crawford told the local newspaper correspondent, who had traveled up from Knoxville to cover the story. The sheriff was a practical man who had seen his share of mountain tragedies: hunting accidents, moonshine wars, domestic disputes that ended in violence. But the Hensley twins' disappearance defied every pattern he knew. The bloodhounds brought up from the county seat lost the scent at the river's edge, circling in confusion before sitting down and whining. Local tracking expert Jeremiah White, a man whose Cherokee grandmother had taught him to read the mountain's secrets, spent 2 days studying the ground where the twins were last seen. "Tracks go down to the water," he reported to Crawford. 2 sets, side by side, like they was walking normal. Then nothing, like the river swallowed them up or they grew wings and flew away. But rivers give up their dead, especially mountain rivers that crashed over rocks and caught bodies in eddies and shallow pools. Even if the twins had drowned, searchers should have found something. October 1st, 1918, Sheriff's Report, Case number 47. Search discontinued after 2 weeks. No evidence of foul play. Classification: missing persons, presumed drowned. The mountains kept their silence. Ruth Hensley lived another 15 years, dying in 1933 with her daughter's names on her lips. Her neighbors said she spent every Sunday afternoon walking the riverbank where the twins had vanished, carrying 2 bouquets of mountain laurel and calling their names, until her voice echoed off the limestone cliffs like a prayer made of grief. The disappearance of the Hensley twins settled into Copper Creek Valley's collective memory like silt after a flood, becoming part of the landscape that shaped how families understood their world. Parents held their children closer. Young women didn't walk alone after dark. The river, which had always been a source of life and sustenance, took on an edge of menace that older residents claimed had always been present if you knew how to look. But whispers traveled through the mountain communities like creek water finding its path to the sea, carrying fragments of speculation and half-remembered stories that painted the twins' disappearance in stranger colors than simple drowning. Sarah McKnight, who lived 3 hollers over and claimed distant kinship with the legendary mountain witch of Bone Ridge, told anyone who would listen that the twins had been called by the old spirits that lived beneath the river's surface. Her grandmother, she said, had warned her about the Cherokee burial grounds that lay submerged where the Clinch River curved around Devil's Elbow. The Cherokee angle wasn't entirely folklore. County records showed that Ezekiel Hensley, the twins' great-grandfather, had married a Cherokee woman named Ayanna in 1843, 5 years after the forced removal that local families rarely discussed. Their union had been controversial even then, but Ezekiel had been a stubborn man who farmed bottom land that no one else could make productive. Thomas Morrison, the boy who had last seen the twins alive, developed a reputation for elaborate stories about that September afternoon. Sometimes he claimed he had heard singing coming from across the river, voices that harmonized with the twins' own before fading into silence. Other times he insisted he had seen figures in the trees on the opposite bank, watching the girls with an attention that made his skin crawl. November 7th, 1918. Personal Journal, Dr. M. Webb. Mrs. Morrison brought Thomas to see me today, concerned about his persistent nightmares regarding the Hensley girls. During examination, the boy described seeing the twins walking into the water without getting wet, and claimed their dresses remained white and dry even as they moved deeper into the river. The most unsettling whisper came from Ezra Blackwood, whose family had lived in the deepest part of the valley since before the Revolution. Ezra was known as a man who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. So when he spoke about the twins at all, people listened. "There's things in these mountains that don't follow the rules most folks understand," he told his son-in-law while they were splitting firewood one October evening. The twins' great-grandmother, Ayanna, she knew them things, used to say the river was just a doorway for those who knew how to knock. When pressed for details, Ezra would only add that Ayanna had taught her granddaughters certain songs and ceremonies that had been passed down through Cherokee families for generations before the removal. Songs that were meant to honor the spirits that lived beneath running water. The speculation might have remained mountain folklore if not for the events of November 19th, 1918, when 3 separate families reported seeing lights moving beneath the surface of the Clinch River, near the spot where the twins had vanished. The lights appeared for 3 consecutive nights, pulsing like heartbeats in the dark water before fading at dawn. Sheriff Crawford investigated personally, spending a cold night on the riverbank with binoculars and a notebook. He saw the lights, described them in his official report as phosphorescent phenomena, possibly caused by decaying organic matter, but couldn't explain why they appeared only in that specific stretch of river. What would you do if you heard your name called by voices from beneath the water, buried beneath the surface? The winter of 1918 brought more than snow to Copper Creek Valley. It brought silence, the kind of communal quiet that settles over mountain communities when everyone agrees, without discussing it, that certain topics are better left undisturbed. The search for the Hensley twins had officially ended, but the questions their disappearance raised about the valley's hidden history began eating at the foundations of stories families had been telling themselves for generations. Judge Harrison Caldwell, who presided over the county court from his mansion in the valley's most prosperous section, had lived through the Cherokee removal as a boy and remembered details that most of his neighbors preferred to forget. His father had been one of the local officials who had helped organize the forced march to Oklahoma, and the family's prosperity had been built partly on Cherokee lands acquired through legal mechanisms that looked different in hindsight. December 3rd, 1918, personal correspondence, Judge H. Caldwell. The business with the Hensley girls has stirred up conversations that are better left buried. Several families have approached me about the Cherokee burial grounds beneath the river, asking whether we have any legal obligation to investigate or acknowledge them. I have advised that the past is past. But legal obligations and moral responsibilities didn't always align, as Caldwell's own family history demonstrated. His grandfather's papers, stored in a locked trunk in the judge's study, contained correspondence with federal agents that revealed the systematic nature of Cherokee land appropriation in their region. More troubling were the references to families who had hidden Cherokee relatives during the removal, creating a genetic legacy that connected many current residents to the people their ancestors had helped displace. The Hensley family's Cherokee ancestry wasn't unique. The Morrison widow, the Bakers, even the prominent Crawford family that had produced the current sheriff, all carried bloodlines that traced back to Cherokee women who had married white settlers before removal became inevitable. These connections had been carefully obscured over the decades, mentioned only in whispers and family stories that grew vaguer with each generation. Martha Creech, who ran the Valley's general store and served as its unofficial historian, possessed the most complete picture of these hidden genealogies. Her ledgers didn't just track who owed money for flour and tobacco. They recorded births, marriages, and deaths that revealed the intricate web of relationships connecting the Valley's seemingly separate families. Half the families in this valley got Cherokee blood, she confided to her daughter while they were inventorying stock one December evening. But they'd rather claim descent from Scottish kings than acknowledge their great-grandmothers who knew which plants could heal and which ones could kill. Mary Sutton, whose Cherokee great-grandmother had taught her to read the movements of water and wind, knew things about the Clinch River that she shared with no one. She understood why certain pools stayed warm even in winter, why some sections of the riverbank bloomed with flowers that grew nowhere else in the mountains, why the water sometimes sang with voices that weren't quite human. 2 weeks after the twins vanished, Mary had walked to the spot where they were last seen and performed a ceremony her great-grandmother had taught her, burning sweetgrass and tobacco while speaking words in a language that federal authorities had tried to erase from memory. She had seen things that night, figures moving beneath the water's surface, lights that pulsed with the rhythm of a massive heartbeat. But she told no one. Dr. Webb encountered evidence of this hidden knowledge network when he was treating influenza cases during the epidemic that struck the valley in early 1919. Several families brought their sick children to women who used traditional Cherokee remedies alongside or instead of his medical treatments. The plant combinations these women prepared were more sophisticated than anything Webb had learned in medical school. The most unsettling discovery came when Webb was called to treat old Samuel Morrison, who was dying of consumption. The old man, delirious with fever, spoke for hours in what Webb initially assumed was gibberish, but gradually recognized as Cherokee language mixed with English. Samuel told stories about underwater cities where the ancestors lived, about rivers that served as roads between worlds. The twins knew, Samuel whispered to Webb during one of his more lucid moments. Their great-grandmother taught their grandmother, and she taught them. They'd been preparing their whole lives for the calling. The influenza epidemic that swept through Copper Creek Valley in January of 1919 revealed fault lines in the community that the twins' disappearance had only begun to expose. While Dr. Webb struggled to treat patients with limited medical supplies and outdated techniques, a parallel healing network operated in the shadows, led by women who possessed knowledge that had been declared extinct by federal authorities decades earlier. Rebecca Thornton, whose Cherokee grandmother had taught her the medicinal properties of every plant that grew on the mountainsides, found herself treating more patients than the official doctor. Her cabin, hidden in a fold of the mountains that didn't appear on any surveyor's map, became a pilgrimage destination for families whose children were dying despite Webb's interventions. The plants Rebecca used, wild ginseng for fevers, yellow root for infections, bloodroot for respiratory ailments, weren't found in any medical textbook, but they worked with an efficacy that drew desperate families willing to risk association with Indian doctoring. More importantly, Rebecca's treatments came with ceremonies that addressed not just physical illness, but the spiritual imbalances that Cherokee tradition identified as the root of disease. February 10, 1919. Personal notes, Dr. M. Webb. Lost 3 patients this week to influenza, including the Baker infant. Meanwhile, Rebecca Thornton claims to have cured 12 cases using methods I cannot comprehend or replicate. Have asked to observe her treatments, but she declines, saying her medicine works only within proper ceremonial context. The women in Rebecca's network, Martha Sutton, and a handful of others whose Cherokee ancestry had been carefully hidden, possessed more than plant knowledge. They maintained connections to the spiritual traditions that had governed Cherokee life for centuries before removal, adapting ancient practices to the reality of life in a culture that denied their existence. These women had watched the Hensley twins grow up with attention that their families had never fully understood. The twins' Cherokee heritage was more pronounced than most. Their great-grandmother, Ayanna, had been a full-blooded Cherokee who had managed to avoid removal by marrying into a white family, and she had passed down not just bloodline, but active knowledge of traditional ways. Mabel and Mary Beth was different from the time they could walk. Rebecca told Martha Sutton during one of their weekly gatherings in the winter woods behind Rebecca's cabin. They heard things other children didn't hear, saw things that wasn't there for regular folks. Ayanna, she knew they was special. She taught them the old songs, the water ceremonies, how to listen for the ancestors calling. The gatherings themselves were carefully concealed from the broader community. Once a week, on nights when the moon was dark, the women met to practice ceremonies that had been passed down through oral tradition for generations. They burned sacred plants, sang in Cherokee language that their children and grandchildren weren't allowed to learn, and performed rituals that maintained connections between the physical world and the realm of spirits. During the influenza epidemic, these ceremonies took on increased urgency. The women understood that the disease wasn't just a medical crisis, but a spiritual imbalance that required traditional healing approaches. They worked through the winter nights, treating sick families while performing cleansing rituals for the entire valley. March 1st, 1919. Personal journal, Rebecca Thornton. The sickness is breaking, but the cost has been terrible. 7 families lost children, and the grieving mothers ask questions about where their babies' spirits have gone. I tell them what grandmother taught me, that water carries our loved ones to the place where ancestors wait. The connection between the influenza epidemic and the twins' disappearance wasn't immediately obvious, but the women in Rebecca's network recognized patterns that escaped their neighbors' attention. Cherokee tradition held that the spirit world sometimes called young people during times of community crisis, choosing them to serve as messengers or bridges between the living and the dead. The twins was called because the valley needed healing, Martha Sutton explained to her daughter. Not just healing from the sickness, but healing from all the wounds we've been carrying since the removal. Sometimes the ancestors choose young ones to help with that healing, even if it means they can't stay in this world. The revelation that roughly half the valley's population carried Cherokee ancestry forced Webb to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the community he served. The twins hadn't simply vanished into the river. They had answered a call from traditions that were supposedly extinct, fulfilling obligations that their families barely acknowledged. Spring returned to Copper Creek Valley in April of 1919 with an intensity that old-timers claimed was supernatural. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible abundance along the riverbank where the twins had vanished. Trees leafed out weeks earlier than normal. The Clinch River ran clearer than anyone could remember, its water so transparent that you could see bottom stones 20 feet down that had been invisible for decades. Rebecca Thornton understood these changes as signs that the spiritual healing the twins had been chosen to facilitate was taking effect. But the manifestations troubled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate to her network of Cherokee descendants. "The veil between worlds is thinner than it's been since before the removal," she told Martha Sutton during one of their dawn meetings in the woods. "The twins opened something that maybe should have stayed closed, or maybe needed to be opened, but not in the way they done it." The evidence of supernatural activity became impossible to ignore when families throughout the valley began reporting visitations from relatives who had died years or even decades earlier. These weren't the confused spirits that occasionally troubled the living, but purposeful appearances by ancestors who seemed to be delivering specific messages about hidden family histories and unacknowledged Cherokee connections. Emma Crawford, the sheriff's elderly aunt, woke one morning to find her Cherokee great-grandmother sitting at the kitchen table, wearing the traditional dress she had been buried in 70 years earlier. The apparition spoke in Cherokee for nearly an hour, explaining bloodline connections and ceremonial obligations that Emma's family had abandoned after removal. When the spirit faded with dawn light, Emma found tobacco leaves arranged in patterns on her table that she somehow understood represented a map of Cherokee burial sites throughout the valley. April 15th, 1919. Personal diary. Emma Crawford. Grandmother Two Bears came to me again last night. She showed me where the underwater burial grounds are located, why the twins was called to serve as guardians. Says our family has obligations we've been ignoring for 3 generations, and the time has come to honor the ancestors proper. Dr. Webb documented 17 cases of similar visitations between April and June of 1919, eventually realizing that the appearances weren't random but followed family lines that connected to Cherokee ancestry. The spirits seemed to be systematically contacting descendants who carried the bloodline but had lost knowledge of their heritage, providing information about traditional ceremonies, medicinal plants, and spiritual obligations. The most significant visitation occurred to Judge Caldwell himself, whose Cherokee great-grandmother appeared in his study while he was reviewing legal documents related to land ownership in the valley. The spirit, identifying herself as Nancy Ridge, revealed that the judge's family wealth had been built on Cherokee burial grounds that had never been properly consecrated or protected. Nancy Ridge's appearance was particularly significant because she provided specific information about the underwater burial grounds beneath the Clinch River, explaining that Cherokee families had been placing their dead in river caverns for centuries before white settlement. The practice had continued in secret even after removal, with surviving Cherokee families returning to bury their dead in the traditional way despite the legal risks. May the 20th, 1919, handwritten note found in Judge Caldwell's papers. Nancy Ridge says the twins went willingly but unprepared. They knew the old songs, but not the proper protections. They opened the way to the ancestor realm, but couldn't return because they lacked the complete ceremonies. Their sacrifice restored communication between worlds, but trapped them between the living and the dead. Rebecca Thornton's network began working frantically to reconstruct the complete Cherokee burial ceremonies, combining knowledge from multiple families who had preserved fragments of the original traditions. They understood that the twins' disappearance had created a spiritual crisis that required traditional resolution, but none of them possessed complete knowledge of the water ceremonies needed to restore proper balance. The The breakthrough came when Martha Sutton's granddaughter, Ruth, experienced a vision that provided missing elements of the burial ceremonies. In her vision, Ruth saw the twins in an underwater city beneath the Clinch River, serving as guardians for hundreds of Cherokee ancestors whose graves had been disturbed or forgotten over the decades since removal. "They ain't dead," Ruth explained to Rebecca's network during an emergency gathering. "They're alive in the ancestor realm, doing work that needed to be done. But they can't rest until we do our part. Acknowledge our Cherokee heritage, restore the proper ceremonies, make things right with the ancestors." The revelation that the twins were alive but trapped between worlds created a moral crisis for families who had spent decades denying their Cherokee connections. Helping the twins required public acknowledgement of Cherokee ancestry that could result in social ostracism, economic persecution, or worse. Summer brought no relief from the spiritual disturbances that had been escalating since the twins' disappearance. If anything, the manifestations intensified as families throughout Copper Creek Valley struggled to balance their desire to help the trapped spirits against their fear of acknowledging Cherokee connections that could destroy their social and economic standing. Sheriff Crawford found himself investigating complaints that defied every category of law enforcement he understood. Families reported objects moving without human intervention, traditional Cherokee songs heard from empty houses, and tobacco offerings that appeared overnight on doorsteps of families who had never admitted to Cherokee heritage. June 10, 1919, Official Incident Report, Sheriff B. Crawford. Called to Morrison property to investigate reports of supernatural disturbances. Found traditional Cherokee ceremonial items arranged in precise patterns throughout the house. Mrs. Morrison claims no knowledge of how the items appeared, but her son Thomas admits to dreams in which his Cherokee great-grandmother instructs him to prepare offerings for spirits trapped beneath the river. The Morrison family's situation represented the moral complexity facing the entire valley. Thomas's mother had spent his entire childhood denying their Cherokee ancestry, teaching him to identify as Scots-Irish despite physical features and family stories that suggested otherwise. But the supernatural visitations were forcing families to confront heritage they had been trained to suppress. Dr. Webb documented the psychological toll of this cultural conflict in his medical notes, observing increased rates of anxiety, insomnia, and depression among families experiencing spiritual visitations. The stress of maintaining denial while being constantly confronted with evidence of Cherokee ancestry was literally making people sick. The economic dimensions of the crisis became apparent when word of the supernatural activities began reaching the county seat and beyond. Potential investors in timber and mining operations, hearing rumors of Indian hauntings, started withdrawing from projects that would have brought significant revenue to the valley. Property values declined as outsiders became reluctant to buy land that might be cursed or subject to Cherokee land claims. Judge Caldwell faced the most severe pressure, since his family's wealth and political position made them particularly vulnerable to any suggestion of Cherokee heritage. The legal documents his Cherokee great-grandmother's spirit had revealed contained information that could undermine not just his family's land holdings, but the entire system of property ownership that had developed since removal. July 2, 1919. Confidential legal memo. Judge H. Caldwell. The spiritual visitations have revealed evidence of Cherokee burial grounds beneath properties throughout the valley, including my own family's holdings. Acknowledging these claims could trigger federal investigation of land titles dating back to removal period. Recommend coordinated community response to suppress information until alternative solutions can be developed. But suppression was becoming impossible as the spiritual manifestations grew bolder and more public. Cherokee ancestors began appearing at community gatherings, including a dramatic incident during Sunday services at Cedar Grove Baptist Church, when the spirit of a Cherokee medicine woman materialized behind the pulpit and began speaking in Cherokee language about the need to honor traditional burial obligations. Pastor Williams, whose own Cherokee heritage had been carefully concealed for decades, found himself torn between his ministerial obligations to his congregation and his growing understanding that the spiritual crisis required acknowledgement of traditions his church had spent generations suppressing. The women in Rebecca Thornton's network understood that time was running out for a peaceful resolution. The Cherokee spirits were growing impatient with the community's reluctance to acknowledge their heritage and honor their obligations. The manifestations were escalating toward what Rebecca recognized from traditional stories as a spiritual reckoning that could destroy the entire valley if not properly addressed. August 1st, 1919, personal notes. Rebecca Thornton. The ancestors are preparing for action that won't wait for white man's comfort. The twins opened the door between worlds, but they can't close it until we do our part. If this community won't honor its Cherokee blood voluntary, the spirits will force acknowledgement in ways that won't be gentle. The crisis reached a breaking point when the Hensley family received a visit from the twins themselves, appearing at their old home in forms that were recognizably Mabel and Mary Beth, but somehow transformed by their time in the ancestor realm. The twins spoke to their grief-stricken parents for hours, explaining their role as guardians of the underwater burial grounds and the spiritual obligation facing their community. "We ain't dead, Mama," Mabel said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the river itself. "But we can't come home until our people stop pretending they don't know who they really are." Ruth Hensley found herself facing a choice between public acknowledgement of Cherokee heritage that could cost her family their farm and their place in the community, or continued denial that would leave her daughters trapped forever between worlds. Bridges between worlds. August of 1919 brought weather that seemed designed to break both spirits and resolve. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for weeks, while the Clinch River dropped to levels that exposed sections of riverbed that hadn't seen sunlight in living memory. The drought revealed things that families had hoped would remain buried forever: Cherokee burial sites, old ceremonial grounds, and evidence of the traditional way of life that had existed in the valley before removal. Ruth Hensley's decision to publicly acknowledge her family's Cherokee heritage created ripples that spread through the community like cracks in drought-hardened earth. Standing in the churchyard after Sunday services, she told the assembled congregation about her daughter's visitation and their role as guardians of the underwater burial grounds. "My girls ain't dead," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who had spoken with her children's spirits. "They're serving the ancestors, doing work that needs to be done to heal this valley, but they can't rest until we stop lying about who we are and where we come from." The reaction was immediate and polarized. Families with obvious Cherokee features found themselves under scrutiny they had spent generations avoiding. Others rallied around Ruth, sharing their own stories of spiritual visitations and ancestral guidance. Pastor Williams surprised his congregation by supporting Ruth's testimony, revealing his own Cherokee great-grandmother and the traditional ceremonies he had been practicing in secret to maintain spiritual balance in the community. His admission gave other families permission to acknowledge heritage they had been concealing, but it also created a division within the church that reflected broader tensions throughout the valley. August 15th, 1919. Church meeting minutes. Congregation voted to establish committee for investigating Cherokee heritage claims and developing appropriate responses to spiritual manifestations. Brother Williams to lead committee with assistance from families who have acknowledged indigenous connections. opposition voiced by members who fear economic and social consequences of public acknowledgement. Dr. Webb documented the immediate health improvements among families who chose to acknowledge their Cherokee ancestry, noting significant decreases in anxiety, insomnia, and depression that had plagued the community since the twins' disappearance. The psychological relief of ending decades of cultural denial seemed to have measurable medical benefits, but economic consequences materialized quickly. Several families who publicly acknowledged Cherokee heritage found their credit cut off at the general store, their children excluded from social activities, and their employment prospects severely limited. The social cost of truth was exactly what families had spent generations trying to avoid. Judge Caldwell faced the most severe pressure, since his family's wealth and political position made them visible targets for those who opposed acknowledgement of Cherokee heritage. Anonymous letters threatened legal action to void land titles based on Cherokee burial ground claims. Political opponents began questioning his fitness for office if he couldn't maintain order in his own jurisdiction. The federal response revealed the legal complexity of acknowledging Cherokee connections in communities where indigenous heritage had been systematically suppressed. Government officials preferred to maintain the fiction that Cherokee people had been completely removed from the region, since acknowledging surviving populations would trigger obligations under federal treaties that had been ignored for decades. Rebecca Thornton's network of Cherokee descendants faced their own crisis, as increased scrutiny threatened to expose the traditional ceremonies they had been practicing in secret. Federal agents, responding to reports of Indian activities, began investigating the women who had been maintaining Cherokee spiritual traditions, threatening them with prosecution under laws designed to suppress indigenous culture. September 20th, 1919. Coded message in Rebecca Thornton's papers. The waterkeepers must gather at the hidden place when the moon is dark. The bridge builders need ceremony completion before the cold comes. Federal shadows growing longer, but ancestors' work cannot wait. The twins appeared more frequently to their parents and other Cherokee descendants, providing guidance about traditional ceremonies while expressing growing urgency about the need for community action. Their messages made clear that individual acknowledgement wasn't sufficient. Healing the wounds created by removal required collective recognition of Cherokee heritage and community-wide participation in traditional ceremonies. The ancestors are losing patience, Mabel warned during one visitation to Rebecca Thornton. They understand why our people been hiding, but hiding time is over. The valley needs healing that can only come from truth, even if truth brings pain. The crisis required a solution that would allow families to honor their Cherokee heritage without sacrificing their economic survival or social standing. But finding that solution would require cooperation between community members who had been taught to mistrust each other and federal authorities who preferred to ignore Cherokee survival entirely. October of 1919 brought the first frost to Copper Creek Valley, and with it a sense of urgency that made the summer's spiritual manifestations seem like gentle warnings compared to what was building beneath the surface of community life. The twins' appearances became more frequent and more insistent, their messages increasingly focused on a specific date. October 31st. The night when Cherokee tradition held that the veil between worlds was thinnest. They say all the Cherokee families need to gather at the river that night, Ruth Hensley told Rebecca Thornton during one of their increasingly frequent conferences. They say it's the only time when the full ceremony can be performed, when they can complete the work they were called to do and finally rest. But gathering all the Cherokee descendants for a traditional ceremony would require families to publicly acknowledge heritage they had spent decades concealing, and the social and economic consequences of such acknowledgement had become increasingly severe as autumn progressed. Several families who had admitted Cherokee connections found themselves completely excluded from community economic life, unable to buy supplies, sell crops, or find employment. The federal government's response to reports of Indian activities added another layer of danger to the situation. Bureau of Indian Affairs agents had arrived in the county seat in September, tasked with investigating claims that Cherokee populations had survived removal in significant numbers. Their presence created the possibility that acknowledging Cherokee heritage could result not just in social ostracism, but in forced relocation under laws that remained active despite decades of non-enforcement. October 10, 1920. BIA Field Report, Agent M. Thompson. Investigation reveals substantial Cherokee population in Copper Creek Valley, estimated 40 to 60 individuals across multiple family lines. Population appears to have maintained cultural practices, including traditional ceremonies and medicinal knowledge. Recommend immediate assessment for relocation to designated Cherokee territory in Oklahoma. Dr. Webb understood the medical implications of the crisis better than anyone else in the valley. His records showed clear correlations between Cherokee heritage acknowledgement and improved mental health, but also documented the physical toll of social ostracism on families who had made their ancestry public. The community was literally being torn apart by the choice between spiritual health and economic survival. The supernatural manifestations were escalating toward what Rebecca's network recognized as a critical threshold. Cherokee spirits were appearing not just to their descendants, but to anyone in the valley, delivering increasingly specific messages about the consequences of continued denial. The spirits made clear that October 31st represented a deadline. If proper ceremonies weren't performed that night, the spiritual imbalance would reach a point where it could no longer be peacefully resolved. Judge Caldwell found himself at the center of the crisis when his Cherokee great-grandmother's spirit appeared during a county court session, speaking in Cherokee language while pointing to specific families in the courtroom who needed to acknowledge their heritage. The public manifestation created political pressure that threatened not just Caldwell's career, but the entire legal framework that governed land ownership in the valley. The sheriff faced his own crisis when Cherokee spirits began appearing at crime scenes, providing evidence about historical injustices that connected to current legal problems. The spirits revealed information about murders, land fraud, and other crimes committed against Cherokee families during and after removal, creating legal obligations that Crawford was unprepared to address. Rebecca Thornton's network had reconstructed enough of the traditional water ceremonies to understand what the twins were asking the community to perform on October 31st. The ceremony required participation from representatives of every Cherokee family line in the valley, acknowledgement of connection to the underwater burial grounds, and formal recognition of obligations to Cherokee ancestors. But the ceremony also required cooperation from community leaders who weren't Cherokee, since proper relationship between worlds involved recognition by all groups who shared the land. This meant Judge Caldwell, Sheriff Crawford, Pastor Williams, and other authority figures would need to formally acknowledge Cherokee spiritual claims and agree to protect Cherokee sacred sites. The twins' most recent appearance had been to the entire Cherokee network simultaneously, a manifestation that revealed the urgency of their situation and the scope of what was required for their release from guardian duty. "We've been holding the ancestor realm open for 9 months," Mary Beth told the assembled Cherokee descendants. "But we can't hold it much longer without proper ceremony to establish permanent connections. If the ceremony fails on October 31st, the door between worlds will close for generations, and Cherokee spiritual traditions in this valley will die completely." With 6 days remaining before the deadline, Neither cooperation nor failure seemed possible given the divisions that had torn the community apart over the previous year. 5 days before the October 31st deadline, an unlikely alliance began forming in Judge Caldwell's law office, where community leaders who had spent months avoiding each other gathered to confront a crisis that threatened to destroy not just individual families, but the entire social order that governed life in Copper Creek Valley. Pastor Williams arrived first, carrying a worn Bible and a small pouch of traditional Cherokee tobacco that his great-grandmother had left him before her death. Sheriff Crawford followed, his official demeanor barely concealing the exhaustion of a man who had been investigating crimes that defied every law enforcement protocol he understood. Dr. Webb brought medical records documenting the health crisis affecting families caught between spiritual obligations and social pressures. Rebecca Thornton represented the Cherokee Network, accompanied by Martha Sutton and 3 other women whose knowledge of traditional ceremonies would be essential for any resolution. Their presence in Caldwell's office represented a risk that could result in federal prosecution, but the alternatives had become unacceptable. "We need to understand exactly what's being asked of us," Caldwell began, his lawyer's training asserting itself despite the supernatural nature of the crisis. "If we participate in Cherokee ceremonies, we're acknowledging Cherokee land rights under federal law. That creates legal obligations that could destroy property ownership throughout the valley." Rebecca answered with the directness of a woman who had spent 9 months watching her community tear itself apart over questions that had simple answers if people were willing to accept them. "The spirits ain't asking for your land, Judge. They're asking for recognition that Cherokee people belong to this land, that we got obligations to the ancestors that can't be ignored." The distinction was legally significant, but practically complicated. Federal treaties established Cherokee rights to burial sites and sacred locations, but those treaties had been systematically ignored since removal. Acknowledging Cherokee spiritual claims could trigger federal intervention that would upend every aspect of community life. October 27, 1919. Meeting notes. Judge H. Caldwell. Cherokee representatives proposed ceremony that would acknowledge spiritual rights without challenging current land ownership. Federal law regarding sacred sites remains unclear, but failure to address spiritual crisis threatens community stability more than potential legal complications. Dr. Webb presented medical evidence that convinced the practical-minded men in the room that some form of resolution was essential for community survival. His records showed that families experiencing supernatural manifestations were suffering from stress-related illnesses that were spreading throughout the valley like a contagion. Pastor Williams provided the theological framework that allowed Christian community leaders to justify participation in Cherokee ceremonies without abandoning their religious beliefs. His interpretation emphasized the universal nature of honoring ancestors and caring for burial sites, principles that appeared in Cherokee tradition and Christian teaching alike. Sheriff Crawford's concerns were purely practical: how to maintain law and order in a community where supernatural manifestations were undermining every assumption about cause and effect that governed police work. His recent experiences investigating spirit-related incidents had convinced him that conventional law enforcement was inadequate for the situation the valley faced. The women from Rebecca's network outlined the specific requirements for the October 31st ceremony, explaining that traditional Cherokee water ceremonies required participation from all groups who shared responsibility for protecting sacred sites. This meant community leaders would need to formally acknowledge Cherokee spiritual claims and commit to protecting Cherokee burial grounds under their jurisdiction. The most difficult negotiation involved the economic consequences of Cherokee recognition for families who had built their prosperity on land acquired during removal. Judge Caldwell's family, along with several other prominent families, faced the possibility that acknowledging Cherokee burial rights could result in land use, restrictions, or federal oversight that would destroy their financial security. The breakthrough came when Rebecca's network proposed a solution that had precedent in Cherokee legal tradition: recognition of Cherokee spiritual rights in exchange for formal adoption of white families into Cherokee kinship networks. This would create mutual obligations that protected both Cherokee sacred sites and white economic interests. Cherokee law has always included adoption for families who marry into the nation or who demonstrate commitment to Cherokee welfare, Martha Sutton explained. If white families accept formal kinship obligations, they become Cherokee by law and custom, which gives them rights instead of taking rights away. Judge Caldwell's decision would determine whether the October 31st ceremony could proceed with the cooperation needed for success, or whether the community would face the consequences of failing to meet the spiritual deadline that the twins had established. October 29th brought weather that seemed conjured from Cherokee stories about the night when spirits walked freely between worlds. Thick fog that swirled up from the Clinch River, like smoke from sacred fires. Air so still that every sound carried for miles, and a quality of light that made ordinary objects appear otherworldly even in broad daylight. Judge Caldwell spent the night before the ceremony deadline reviewing family papers that his Cherokee great-grandmother's spirit had revealed, documents that traced his genealogy back to Cherokee leaders who had signed the original treaties with the federal government. The papers established not just Cherokee blood in his family line, but legal standing that could protect the entire valley if properly acknowledged. Dawn found him standing at his office window, watching fog roll through the valley like a river of ghosts, while behind him lay the adoption papers that Rebecca's network had prepared according to traditional Cherokee law. His signature would make him formally Cherokee by adoption, with all the spiritual obligations and legal rights that status entailed. The judge's decision will determine whether we can save the twins or lose them forever, Martha Sutton told her granddaughter as they prepared tobacco offerings for the evening ceremony. But it will also determine whether Cherokee ways survive in this valley or die with our generation. Across the valley, families were making similar choices about participating in a ceremony that would require public acknowledgement of Cherokee heritage and acceptance of spiritual obligations that would govern their behavior for generations. The economic and social consequences of Cherokee recognition had become severe enough to force some families to choose between spiritual health and material survival. Dr. Webb documented the community's psychological state in notes that revealed a population balanced on the edge of collective breakdown. 9 months of supernatural manifestations, social division, and economic pressure had created stress levels that were literally killing people who couldn't resolve the conflict between spiritual necessity and practical fear. October 29, 1919. Medical observations, Dr. M. Webb. Community experiencing mass psychological crisis that defies medical categories. Families caught between supernatural obligations and social pressures, showing symptoms of severe trauma. Tonight's ceremony represents last opportunity for resolution before complete community breakdown becomes inevitable. The Cherokee descendants had spent weeks preparing for a ceremony that none of them had ever seen performed in its complete form. The traditional water ceremonies had been broken into fragments over decades of secrecy, with different families preserving different elements of the original rituals. Reconstruction required combining knowledge from multiple sources, while accepting that some elements had been lost forever. Rebecca Thornton's network had worked through the night to prepare the ceremonial items needed for proper acknowledgement of the underwater burial grounds. Tobacco grown from seeds her great-grandmother had preserved since before removal. Traditional Cherokee songs transcribed from memory, and ceremonial objects that had been hidden for generations to protect them from federal authorities. The twins' appearances throughout the day carried a quality of urgency and finality that made clear this was the last opportunity for the ceremony they had died to enable. Their messages revealed details about the underwater realm where they served as guardians, describing a vast city beneath the Clinch River, where Cherokee ancestors waited for proper acknowledgement from the living. Pastor Williams faced his own crisis of faith as he prepared to participate in ceremonies that his theological training had taught him to view as paganism, but which his Cherokee heritage and recent spiritual experiences revealed as authentic communication with the divine. His decision to participate represented a theological revolution that could transform not just his own ministry, but Christian understanding of indigenous spirituality throughout the region. Sheriff Crawford prepared for a night of law enforcement, unlike anything in his training, knowing that federal agents might attempt to interrupt the ceremony and arrest Cherokee participants under laws designed to suppress indigenous culture. His decision to protect the ceremony rather than enforce federal regulations represented a choice between competing legal obligations that could end his career. As sunset approached, 47 Cherokee descendants gathered at the riverbank, where the twins had vanished 13 months earlier, carrying traditional offerings and wearing clothing that incorporated Cherokee colors and patterns that had been hidden in family trunks for generations. They were joined by 12 white community leaders who had decided to accept formal Cherokee adoption and the spiritual obligations that adoption entailed. Judge Caldwell arrived as the sun touched the ridgetops, carrying the adoption papers that would legally establish him as Cherokee by choice rather than just birth, accepting obligations that would govern not just his own behavior, but his family's relationship with Cherokee sacred sites for generations to come. His signature, witnessed by the Cherokee adoptees and sealed with traditional tobacco offerings, created legal precedents that would protect Cherokee spiritual rights while establishing new forms of community identity that transcended the racial categories that had divided the valley since removal. Full darkness settled over Copper Creek Valley like a ceremonial blanket as 59 Cherokee descendants and adoptees gathered at the riverbank, where Mabel and Beth Hensley had vanished 13 months earlier. The Clinch River ran black as obsidian beneath stars that seemed unusually bright, their light reflecting off water that moved with the slow rhythm of a sleeping giant's breathing. Rebecca Thornton stood at the water's edge holding eagle feathers that her great-grandmother had carried during the forced march to Oklahoma, before slipping away to return to these mountains in defiance of federal law. The feathers had been blessed by Cherokee medicine keepers for 9 generations, carrying spiritual power that connected the present ceremony to traditions that predated white settlement by centuries. We gather tonight to honor the ancestors who sleep beneath these waters, she announced in Cherokee language, her words carrying across the river like music. We gather to acknowledge the bloodlines that connect us to this land, and to complete the work that Mabel and Beth began when they answered the ancestors' calling. Judge Caldwell knelt on the riverbank beside other white community leaders who had accepted Cherokee adoption, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared to speak words that would transform not just his legal status, but his spiritual obligations for the remainder of his life. I acknowledge my Cherokee great-grandmother, Nancy Ridge, and accept the obligations that come with Cherokee blood, he said, following the formula that Rebecca had taught him. I accept adoption into the Cherokee Nation and pledge to protect the sacred sites that my family's lands encompass. One by one, the other adoptees spoke similar words, formally acknowledging Cherokee kinship and accepting spiritual responsibilities that would govern their relationship with the land and the ancestors permanently. Pastor Williams, Sheriff Crawford, Dr. Webb, and 8 other community leaders became Cherokee by law and custom, creating legal frameworks that would protect Cherokee spiritual rights while maintaining economic and social stability. The water ceremony itself required participants to wade into the Clinch River while singing traditional Cherokee songs that had been reconstructed from fragments preserved by multiple families. The songs called to the underwater spirits, acknowledging their guardianship of Cherokee burial grounds and requesting communication with the ancestors who dwelt beneath the water. As the participants moved deeper into the river, the water began to glow with phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from the riverbed itself. The light pulsed with the rhythm of the ceremonial songs, creating patterns that traced the locations of underwater burial caverns throughout the river system. The twins appeared as the ceremony reached its climax, rising from the water in forms that were recognizably Mabel and Beth, but transformed by 13 months of service as guardians between worlds. They moved through the water without disturbing its surface, their voices harmonizing with the ceremonial songs in ways that created music unlike anything the participants had ever heard. "The ancestors are satisfied," Mabel announced, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the river itself. "The Cherokee people of this valley have acknowledged their heritage and accepted their obligations. The doorway between worlds can remain open permanently now, allowing proper communication between the living and the dead." Beth spoke to individual families, delivering messages from Cherokee ancestors who had been waiting for acknowledgement since their deaths generations earlier. The messages contained genealogical information, traditional knowledge about medicinal plants, and spiritual guidance that had been lost when Cherokee culture was forced underground. The most significant communication came from Ayanna, the twins' Cherokee great-grandmother, who appeared in the river surrounded by dozens of other Cherokee spirits. She explained that the underwater burial grounds contained the remains of Cherokee leaders, medicine keepers, and warriors who had chosen to be buried in the traditional way despite federal laws prohibiting Cherokee ceremonies. The ceremony concluded with formal establishment of Cherokee spiritual obligations that would govern the valley's relationship with sacred sites permanently. Participants pledged to protect Cherokee burial grounds, maintain traditional ceremonies, and ensure that Cherokee spiritual knowledge would be passed down to future generations. As dawn approached, the twins began to fade but did not disappear entirely. They had chosen to remain in the valley as spiritual guides rather than passing into the ancestor realm, serving as bridges between the Cherokee community and the spirits beneath the water. "We'll always be here when our people need us," Mabel said, as her form became translucent in the growing daylight. "The doorway between worlds stays open now, and Cherokee ways will survive in this valley, no matter what the future brings." Spring of 1920 brought changes to Copper Creek Valley that would have seemed impossible before the twins' ceremony opened permanent pathways between the Cherokee community and the ancestor realm. The Clinch River ran clearer than it had in decades, its waters revealing underwater rock formations that older Cherokee residents recognized as traditional ceremonial sites that had been submerged since white settlement altered the river's flow. Judge Caldwell's transformation from reluctant participant to active Cherokee advocate created legal precedents that protected indigenous spiritual rights while maintaining economic stability for families who had built their prosperity on land that contained Cherokee sacred sites. His adoption into the Cherokee Nation gave him standing to negotiate agreements that balanced Cherokee spiritual obligations with white economic interests. The Cherokee descendants who had participated in the October ceremony found their lives transformed in ways that extended far beyond spiritual relief. Knowledge passed down from Cherokee ancestors through the open doorway included information about medicinal plants, agricultural techniques, and natural resource management that proved valuable for community survival during the economic difficulties that followed World War I. March 15, 1920, Community Development Notes. Judge H. Caldwell. Cherokee agricultural knowledge recovered through ancestor communications has increased crop yields by 30% over previous year. Traditional plant medicine reduces community healthcare costs while improving treatment outcomes. Cherokee adoption ceremony created legal frameworks that protect indigenous rights while maintaining white economic participation. Dr. Webb documented remarkable health improvements among families who had participated in the ceremony, noting the complete resolution of anxiety, depression, and stress-related illnesses that had plagued the community during the spiritual crisis. More significantly, he observed the development of enhanced healing abilities among Cherokee descendants who had re-established connections with traditional medicine knowledge. Rebecca Thornton emerged as the Valley's primary spiritual leader, coordinating between Cherokee descendants, white adoptees, and the ancestor spirits, who now communicated regularly through the opened doorway. Her role required balancing traditional Cherokee protocols with the practical needs of a mixed community that included families with varying levels of Cherokee heritage and spiritual commitment. The federal government's response to Cherokee recognition in the Valley created initial tensions, but ultimately established precedents that protected indigenous spiritual rights throughout the Appalachian region. Bureau of Indian Affairs agents who had initially threatened forced relocation found themselves negotiating with Cherokee adoptees who possessed legal standing and political influence that complicated traditional enforcement approaches. April 10, 1920. Artoticum. Federal Correspondence. BIA Agent M. Thompson. Cherokee population in Copper Creek Valley has established legal standing through adoption of prominent white citizens who now possess Cherokee rights under federal treaty obligations. Forced relocation no longer practical, given political complications and community integration. Recommend recognition of local Cherokee governance under existing federal frameworks. The twins' ongoing presence as spiritual guides created a permanent bridge between the Cherokee community and the ancestor realm, enabling regular communication with Cherokee spirits who provided guidance about everything from crop management to legal strategy. Their role evolved from guardian duty to community leadership that transcended the boundaries between living and dead. Pastor Williams's ministry transformed as he integrated Cherokee spiritual practices with Christian theology, creating a synthesis that attracted families from throughout the region who were seeking religious approaches that honored both Christian and indigenous traditions. His theological innovations influenced other ministers who served communities with hidden Cherokee heritage. Sheriff Crawford's law enforcement approach evolved to incorporate Cherokee dispute resolution methods that emphasized community healing rather than punitive justice. Traditional Cherokee law focused on restoring balance between parties rather than punishment, creating more effective approaches to community conflicts than conventional legal systems provided. The economic benefits of Cherokee knowledge recovery extended beyond agriculture to include sustainable forestry practices, traditional craft production, and ecotourism that attracted visitors interested in authentic Cherokee culture. The Valley's economy strengthened, while environmental protection improved through traditional Cherokee land management techniques. The educational impact proved equally significant as Cherokee language, history, and traditional knowledge began being taught to children whose families had previously suppressed all evidence of indigenous heritage. The next generation grew up understanding themselves as Cherokee by heritage and choice, rather than as white families with shameful secrets. But the transformation required ongoing commitment from participants who had accepted obligations that would affect their families for generations. Cherokee adoption created permanent spiritual and legal relationships that couldn't be abandoned when circumstances changed or when federal policies shifted. The Valley's success in integrating Cherokee spiritual recognition with white economic interests created a model that influenced other Appalachian communities where Cherokee heritage had been hidden for generations. By 1925, Copper Creek Valley had become a pilgrimage destination for Cherokee families throughout the Southeast, who sought to reconnect with traditional spiritual practices that had survived removal and assimilation policies. The permanent doorway between worlds that the twins had died to establish made the valley uniquely valuable for Cherokee spiritual purposes, while creating economic opportunities that benefited both Cherokee and white families. Rebecca Thornton, now recognized as a Cherokee medicine keeper by tribal authorities in Oklahoma, trained a new generation of spiritual leaders who would carry Cherokee traditions forward into an uncertain future. Her students included both Cherokee descendants and white adoptees, whose children would grow up understanding Cherokee spiritual obligations as part of their family heritage. The twins' presence evolved as they adapted their role from crisis intervention to long-term community guidance, appearing regularly to provide spiritual counsel for individual families while maintaining the ceremonial connections that kept the ancestor doorway open. Their transformation from missing persons to permanent spiritual guides created new categories of existence that challenged conventional understanding of life and death. Judge Caldwell's legal innovations influenced state and federal policies regarding indigenous rights in regions where Cherokee populations had survived removal through intermarriage and cultural adaptation. His precedents protected Cherokee spiritual sites throughout the Appalachian region while establishing frameworks for Cherokee governance that didn't require separate territorial jurisdiction. June 1, 1925. Legal precedent summary. Cherokee adoption cases. Recognition of Cherokee spiritual obligations creates enforceable rights under federal treaty law, regardless of residence or blood quantum. Adoption ceremonies establish legal Cherokee status with full rights and obligations under traditional Cherokee law. State courts must recognize Cherokee spiritual rights when established through proper ceremonial procedures. Dr. Webb's medical research on the health benefits of Cherokee spiritual practice influenced academic understanding of the connections between cultural identity and physical wellness. His documentation of healing improvements among families who acknowledged Cherokee heritage contributed to broader recognition of traditional medicine's effectiveness alongside conventional medical treatment. The Cherokee language program that emerged from ancestor communications became a model for indigenous language recovery throughout North America. Cherokee spirits provided linguistic knowledge that had been lost for generations, enabling complete reconstruction of local Cherokee dialects that predated removal. Children who learned Cherokee as a second language reported enhanced spiritual sensitivity and improved academic performance. Pastor Williams's theological work influenced Christian denominations throughout the region, demonstrating that Christian faith could accommodate indigenous spiritual practices without theological contradiction. His Maidan synthesis attracted Native American families who had been forced to choose between Christianity and traditional spirituality, creating larger indigenous Christian communities throughout the Southeast. The economic model that developed in the valley demonstrated that Cherokee cultural practice could generate sustainable prosperity while fulfilling spiritual obligations to protect sacred sites and maintain traditional relationships with the natural environment. Tourism revenue supported Cherokee cultural preservation while educating visitors about indigenous history and contemporary indigenous communities. The environmental impact of Cherokee land management proved particularly significant as traditional ecological knowledge restored environmental balance that had been disrupted by conventional farming and forestry practices. Cherokee agricultural techniques increased soil fertility while reducing erosion. Traditional forestry practices improved forest health while maintaining sustainable timber production. Sheriff Crawford's integration of Cherokee conflict resolution methods reduced crime rates while improving community cohesion, demonstrating that traditional indigenous justice systems could complement conventional law enforcement approaches. His innovations influenced law enforcement policies throughout the region, particularly in communities with significant indigenous populations. The twins' continuing guidance helped families navigate the complex legal and social challenges that arose as Cherokee recognition became more visible and attracted both support and opposition from neighboring communities. Their spiritual counsel proved essential for maintaining community unity while resisting external pressures to abandon Cherokee spiritual practices. By 1925, 3 generations of children had grown up understanding Cherokee heritage as a source of pride rather than shame, creating cultural continuity that would ensure Cherokee survival regardless of future political or social changes. The spiritual foundations established through the twins' sacrifice had created irreversible transformation in how the community understood identity, heritage, and obligations to ancestors. The Valley's success inspired Cherokee communities throughout the diaspora created by removal, demonstrating that Cherokee spiritual traditions could survive and flourish even in circumstances where Cherokee people had been scattered and culturally suppressed for generations.